Australians are getting poorer. GDP data has landed for the recent quarter and it isn't good. Australians simply are generating less output, they have less disposable income, and they are feeling less wealthy. Australia is in a per capita recession. So let's dig into the data and let me know your thoughts about why Australia's economy is having such issues. So let's start with GDP itself. Well, GDP is a measure of economic output. If it falls for 2 consecutive quarters, then there's a recession. Well, in Australia, we don't have a recession per se. GDP increased 0.2% overall in the latest quarter. It increased 1.5% year on year, according to the latest release. However, this is below the prior reading of 2.1% year on year, so GDP growth is lower than it was in the past. And this is a bad result. To put this in perspective, you would ideally want a GDP increase of around 3% year on year. The US GDP, for example, increased 3.1% year on year in their latest reading. Australia's GDP growth is simply not that good. And it gets worse. GDP fell on a per capita basis. What this means is the output per person decreased. So overall, GDP might have gone up. Output might have gone up overall, but the output put out by each person has fallen. It fell 0.3% in the latest quarter and fell 1% year on year. This is the third straight quarterly decline. So what gives? Why is it that GDP is increasing overall, but not per person? Well, in essence, it comes down to immigration. The only reason we are having positive overall GDP growth is immigration. The population increased about 2.4% over the year. This is what is boosting GDP, i.e., if you bring more people into the country, your GDP will go up. But it doesn't mean that people are feeling wealthier because their GDP per capita has gone down. And this is what is underlying the data. Australians are simply feeling less wealthy, probably because they are. Because disposable income actually has decreased. It fell 2.1% year on year. Now, while disposable income did increase during the quarter, it's still well below pre-pandemic levels. Think about that. Disposable income is below that of 2019. That is a terrible result, and is not forecast to reach those levels until 2027. That is, people are going to feel poorer until 2027. That's truly astoundingly awful, and is not a good economic position to be in. This fall is attributable to inflation, a rapid increase in mortgage payments, and an increase in tax costs due to bracket creep. This is something the RBA has repeatedly emphasized. So we've got those three underlying issues: inflation, mortgage payments, and an increase in tax take. Now, inflation to some extent might be heading in the right direction. The latest inflation reading, at least in the monthly data, was 3.4%, which is heading toward the 3% target the RBA has. However, for the RBA to start cutting rates, it needs confidence inflation is heading in the right direction. A couple of blips in the downward direction aren't going to be sufficient, and the RBA is at least going to wait until the second half of the year, it seems, to cut their interest rates. And this means mortgage payments are going to remain high. And when mortgage payments are high, you get a lack of supply of housing because people can't afford to buy new houses. Therefore, you end up with this inflation cycle, particularly in shelter, as there simply is a lack of supply. Now, the increase in tax costs aren't going to go anywhere anytime soon. For example, while the Albanese government has made a lot of noise about their tax cuts, in reality, that's actually a tax increase on higher income earners because it's a reversal of previously legislated tax cuts. They hadn't quite come into place yet, but they were set to do so. So in essence, Anthony Albanese has increased taxes on a portion of the population. He has cut taxes for another portion, but that appears to be eaten up with all of the other costs that are going up, which includes government fees, such as the fees on literally everything the government is putting out, in addition to the costs of things like private health insurance, which many of the people who benefit from the tax cut might actually see an increase in. Notably, therefore, the government's tax take and its spending from that tax take has not adequately boosted GDP, even if we ignore the normative problems with tax and spend budgets. That is, due to bracket creep, the government is taking more money in, but they're not spending it wisely. They are not spending it on things that are increasing productivity or increasing output. It appears the government is frittering away money on things that simply aren't adding value. And this could be because government expenditure is notoriously inefficient. So real per capita consumption fell 2.4% year on year, so people are spending less. But the government, like I've said, is generating more from tax revenue and simply isn't spending that money wisely, because they're not spending it in a manner that can offset that reduction in consumption. This, of course, is a bit of a problem, because the government seemingly is wasting a lot of money. This is unsurprising, because bureaucrats and politicians are spending other people's money. This is a classical agency conflict. We, the voters, vote in the politicians in order to hopefully represent us. But the politicians don't either gain or lose from wasting money. They can waste money on personal causes. They can waste money on pork barreling. They can simply exercise inadequate discipline when spending other people's money. And therefore you get a lot of waste. You get inefficiency. Furthermore, in government departments, there simply is not an incentive to do a better job. It's not like in the private sector, where you might get a bonus for doing a good job. In the public service, that simply doesn't really exist. And therefore, you just end up with stagnant policy decisions and simply a waste of money. Now, labour productivity is also a bad sign. It did increase slightly in the latest quarter. However, it remains below 2022 levels. That is, labour productivity has gone down over the past couple of years and is only starting to slightly recover. It appears that people have gotten burned out. The productivity fall is unsurprising. The more hours you take on to deal with cost of living pressures, the less productive you're going to be in those additional hours. Think of it this way. Say, for example, you had a job where you're working 40 hours a week, and now you need to work another 5 hours a week just to make ends meet. Well, in that case, you might be picking up a job that isn't really in your primary qualification, so you'll be less productive in it. Or you might be much more tired for those additional 5 hours, so again, you'll be less productive. Productivity will go down the more hours someone works generally, unless they are very, very incentivized. And simply ending up in the same place you were before after inflation is not a good incentive. I.e., if you're needing to work 45 hours now, whereas you needed to work 40 hours before, people aren't going to feel incentivized and refreshed. They're going to feel burnt out. And hence we're seeing productivity problems as well. Now, the question is then, is there a solution? Well, you can let me know your thoughts about whether there's a solution in the comments below. But I don't see any of the politicians having any appetite to generate a good solution. Now, to be clear, I think Anthony Albanese is much worse than Peter Dutton, because Peter Dutton doesn't really have much of a solution per se, but all of Anthony Albanese's actions make things worse. And making things worse is certainly a worse problem to have than simply not doing very much. Now, to my mind, indexing tax brackets would be an obvious solution to resolve some of the cost of living pressures, because it resolves the issue of bracket creep. Furthermore, it encourages greater productivity and ambition. In particular, if the only reason you're paying more tax is inflation, well, your disposable income goes down. It's pretty obvious. And as a result, you need to index these. Other countries like the United States do so. Even Paul Keating, a former Labour Prime Minister, hardly a right-winger, said that the tax rate above 39% is confiscatory. Even Paul Keating has called for something akin to this. Now, I don't see the top marginal tax rate going down to 39% anytime soon, but indexing tax brackets, which would benefit everyone, is obviously a bit of a solution. But neither party seems to have any appetite for this at all, because both parties are addicted to bracket creep because it enables them to spend ever more money. Now, Peter Dutton is less bad than Anthony Albanese and Jim Chalmers, both of whom actively attack ambition through the superannuation tax grab, or the tax hikes on high income earners, or their seeming desire to run contracting businesses into the ground by forcing people into a unionized workforce through a number of their labor regulations, or their same job, same pay regulations, which implicitly are just a nonsense regulation, undermining the idea of bonuses and paying people differently based on productivity. They seem to be trying to drive productivity into the ground and seem to be trying to undermine ambition and success. Peter Dutton, to be clear, is not necessarily inspiring. It's not like Peter Dutton has a magic solution here. But Peter Dutton doesn't seem to be proposing policies that make things worse, and therefore he's at least a little bit better than the alternative. Now, Peter Dutton is right to point out that the ALP's plans are bad, but he needs a more inspiring slogan than simply saying, "We're not as bad as the other guy." He needs a more inspiring way of presenting that. And therefore, I'm not necessarily convinced that Peter Dutton will win the next election, and we might be stuck with Anthony Albanese and their bad proposals for the time to come. But let me know your thoughts in the comments below about what is going on.